Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and I appreciate your patience as we got everyone connected. My name is Haley Hardison, and I'm the social media producer here at Education Week. We're excited to host this conversation, which will tackle how teachers can best approach teaching about climate change despite different barriers that make it more challenging to do so. Tonight, I'm joined by Madeline Will and Ariana Prothero, two Education Week reporters who cover climate change in education among various other topics, as well as our expert guests, Elizabeth Kerman and Yen Chu, who's joining us through the @Subject to Climate Twitter account. Elizabeth and Yen, I'd love to open the floor for both of you to introduce yourselves in more detail. Elizabeth, would you like to go first?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh,
Thank
all
you.
right. Hi, my name is Elizabeth Kerman, but most people call me Beth. I live a few miles west of Hershey, Pennsylvania. So when we have a nor'easter, I smell Hershey's chocolate all day long. With in geoenvironmental science, I started my career at the Department of Environmental Protection, but I really wanted to work with students. So I earned my master's degree from Penn State and then ultimately earned my PhD from Texas Tech in global STEM education. So global science and global learning is a passion of mine. I start my day at the middle school, and 2 days a week, I end it at Penn State's Harrisburg campus, where I teach Earth 112, which is climate science for educators. This is my first year doing that. So I have a lot of newbie experience to share about that for you. I have 22 years in K 12 education and 5 in higher ed. So my passions are teaching and science ed, of course, but my goal ultimately is to be a bridge for my students between the raw science and the humanities, of which a great big piece of that is the climate science arena.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yen, would you like to go next?
Sure. So my name is Yen Chu. Listening to Beth speak, we share a couple things in common. So I too have spent 22 years in public education. I've taught every grade and level, sixth grade through 12th grade, in English, math, and also music. I also have a doctorate in education. I'm currently the director of content creation at Subject to Climate, which is an organization that's really aimed to bringing climate change lessons in every subject, every grade, and bringing it out of that. So I am the same with Beth in terms of, except I guess I started on the humanities side, but how can we bring climate change education into the humanities and into non-science spaces?
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction as well, Yen. I'll go ahead and turn the floor over now to Maddie and Ariana, who will be leading tonight's conversation. Maddie and Ariana.
Thanks for so much for setting this up, Haley. This is Ariana, reporter with Education Week. Just want to jump in with a little background a little background info before we get to the questions that Maddie and I have for Beth and Yen. The Education Week Research Center polled a nationally representative group of teens and educators about climate change and education last autumn and winter, and we're going to be referencing those results, the results of those surveys throughout our conversation. And we just wanted to let you know where, when we talk about these survey results, where they come from and who was included in it. So with that, Maddie, you have our first question for our expert panelists, right?
Yes, hi. So we know from our surveys that high school students were really interested in learning more about climate change. But when we talk to experts, they say it's sporadically taught and often only in high school science class. So I'm curious with Beth and Yen, why do you think that is? What barriers are preventing teachers in all grade levels and subjects from teaching about it?
I can jump in first. I think when I hear your question, I immediately think of three barriers, just from my own experience and talking to teachers who are not in science. I think the first barrier is definitely thinking that climate change is a science topic or a science standard, and so therefore it should be addressed in science classes. And as like an English math teacher, I just assume that okay, they're covering that. I think a second barrier that I've definitely felt as a teacher is that I already feel overwhelmed and rushed and pressured to teach all of the standards that are on my plate. and state testing, and coupled now with the impacts of learning loss from the pandemic. And if I already feel overwhelmed with the standards that I have to teach in my content area, it's hard to think about adding on climate change. And so I think that's another barrier. And I think for a third barrier, as I talk to younger teachers, specifically K-12, K to 2, that one of their barriers in talking about climate change is the emotions that the little ones have, feeling overwhelmed, and just feeling a lot of fear and not sure how to manage that in a large classroom. So those are the three barriers that come to mind. Beth, what about you?
Okay, it's interesting because we come at this from very different perspectives. I see climate change is like every new science, so to speak. Big Bang theory, evolution theory, heliocentric solar system, plate tectonics, all of those were accepted by the scientific community long before it was brought into the education system. So, for example, by the late 1960s, early 70s, plate tectonics was accepted by scientists, even though it was first, in 1912, it was kind of first developed. And the United States only brought that into the standards officially in 1996. So I feel that to me is the biggest barrier is that having it be a required content area is just going to take time for the education standards. Now I know they're in NGSS now, but to bring it into what we are doing, because like Yen Yen said, we are so overwhelmed with what we are already doing. It feels like just something else, that we are not prepared for or have time to do with what we are already doing.
That is so fascinating what you were saying, Beth, about plate tectonics. And I just am realizing I was probably among the first wave of school children to learn about that in public school. I had no idea. I would like you to build off of that a little bit more, if you could, Beth. Specifically, what are the barriers that face science teachers that are kind of unique to the science teacher's role? And Yen Yen, if you could, after Beth goes, maybe talk a little bit about how that's true, what the barriers are specifically for social studies teachers, because I think those are the two subjects where I think and correct me if I'm wrong, where we see climate change kind of addressed the most in schools. So Beth, if you wouldn't mind starting off.
Sure. So I think the main barrier kind of goes right off of what I just said. You get buy-in from the scientific community first. And for teachers, it is literally the lack of education. And I am seeing this firsthand in my climate science class for educators at Penn State. And another thing is current teachers, it's very difficult to keep up with the scientific evidence for climate change. And there is a social studies teacher in my building who doesn't quote unquote believe it. And we have some great debates on how, whether you believe it or not, this is real. So I feel like some of it's based on feelings and not the evidence, and not, for teachers, and not necessarily because of a lack of caring, but because a lot of teaching occurs in isolation. So I don't really get to share my area of expertise with other teachers in my building because I have 158 students, every day. So it's just very difficult to have that time, to share our different areas of expertise with each other.
I think from a social studies point of view, the approach to climate change is a little bit different. I think you're looking at a lot more the impacts to different communities, and how does different aspects of climate change impact social spaces, socioeconomic spaces, different communities that are affected disproportionately. And so there's a lot to explore, just even in that aspect, that can sometimes not like take the focus off of climate change, but it really kind of pushes in that direction a little bit. So even if we're talking about the Flint water supply and other communities who have their drinking water significantly impacted. Really looking at how those communities are impacted versus maybe the cause of those. And so, from a social studies point of view, I think some of the colleagues that I've spoken with kind of look at that as a barrier, that they're focusing on the impacts more than the actual causes.
That's interesting. When we polled teachers about, the reasons why they don't teach about climate change, a quarter said that they can't think of any way it's related to the subject they teach. And then another 9% said they think their students are too young for them to teach about it. So Yan Yan, I know this is right up your alley with subject to climate. Could you give us some examples of how climate change could be incorporated in like high school math or a kindergarten class, or those kind of classes where you wouldn't necessarily expect this to be taught?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the part I love. I love connecting subjects together, and the subject of climate just wrote a whole bunch of curriculum addressing this very issue. And what I hear too from teachers is that it's like, where do I start? And so I try to tell them where I start is I think about the skills and the standards that I'm already having to teach, and then I think about, okay, so how can I bring in climate change topics to teach or practice those skills a little bit more. So in terms of math, there's just so much data out there that I could use to teach kids, how do you read this graph and how do you read this chart? And I think I wrote a lesson looking at the precipitation data in New Jersey over 100 years, and so it's like, okay, let's take a 50-year span, take that data and plot those points and draw a line of best fit and write it in slope intercept form. So those are all just basic math skills that are needed, and now I'm just using climate change data to bring that in, and then from there exploring what conclusions they could make. There's lots of things you could do with calculating percent loss of habitat for a species, or even calculating percent loss of farmland after a flood. In English, bringing in climate change as nonfiction companion pieces. There's all sorts of writing that you can do with that. I've had my students just take one topic, do some research on it, and then they have to write very specific different kinds of paragraphs using the same information. So they can write an informative paragraph, they could write a persuasive paragraph, they have to write a paragraph using only pathos or only ethos or only logic. And then kind of compare, like, how is that different? How is my writing change? How does the impact of what I'm saying change? Which one is more convincing in talking about this climate change issue with which people? And then maybe the last example I can think of when I talked with my K through 2 teacher friends that are really dealing with a lot of emotions of the little ones is to create activities that help create space for those kids to put feelings into words and really helping them find healthy outlets for, okay, so you're scared about this. Well, let's just kind of gently push into it a little bit. Like, what are we scared about, or what are we overwhelmed about? And how can we, learn about it in a way that will inform us and help us put our feelings into words and draw them as this picture or act it out in this way. I even made a music lesson for one of my teacher friends that's like, I can't teach climate change in music. And we looked at the Audubon Society with different birds in a local community and listening to the bird song and learning the musicality of writing notation for birdsong, which is different than writing music that we're familiar with. So lots of different ways. Those are just a few examples of how you can bring climate change into these non-science subjects.
And this is Ariana. I wanted to jump in. Maddie's question kind of spurred this additional question I have for Beth. People hear climate change and they think science class. But as we were hearing from Yen Yen, it can be incorporated in a lot of different subject areas. As a science teacher, Beth, what subject areas do you wish you saw more climate change instruction happening in? What would help support you as a science teacher to see what other peers would be teaching in their classes?
Well, I would have to say I would like to just see it being taught in science classes to start off because, we talk of it as climate science first. That is my background. Like, what are the mechanics of it? How is Earth a system? How does ocean temperature impact what's happening in the atmosphere, the salinity of the water, the thermohaline circulation. So I'm much more on the understanding the mechanics of it before we can really address the social issues, because that's the perspective that I come from. That being said, everything that Yan Yan said, I think is kind of what I'm saying is those are typically um and I don't want to use the word easier. Easier isn't the right word, but those are things we can all see, day to day. It's on the news. It's in our neighborhoods. We just had the train derailment here in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Like, we can see those things, but understanding the mechanics of what's going on in the background is kind of the science part of it, and more of a, how do we fix it? How can we take action? How can we use this expertise that we know to, perhaps help with the anxiety of others? So I feel that earth and environmental sciences are a great place to start, but that alone, if there is not that connection made between the sciences and the humanities, the kids, it's very difficult for them to buy in because they just don't feel it. So I would love to see more of it in social studies and in math and mathematics and language arts. I mean, writing about your worries and things, I think are super worthy in making the difficulty of learning the science of the atmosphere, the ocean, and all of that relevant and worth that effort.
So I think a lot of this maybe starts with teacher preparation, and I'm curious, what Elizabeth, when you're teaching science teachers, what are educators in training? What are they learning about how to teach climate change, and how does that affect what we see happening in the classroom?
Okay, so just as a little background, I was asked to teach this class December 15th, and it started January 9th, I believe. So the classes that I'm teaching, it is called Climate Science for Educators, but I have 5 non-majors in there. So it's actually an Earth elective for them, a natural science elective. So I kind of was a little bit blindsided by that. But what I see is that future teachers in the program, they do not have to take it. And the students that are in there have a passion, curiosity about climate science and climate change, and they want to learn about it. So my goal in this class was some climate science literacy for them, that they feel confident. Most of the students, I mean, in that class they're 18 to 24 years old, and a lot of them, because of COVID, they didn't have any labs. And, I had them do 2 labs, a greenhouse effect and an albedo lab. And they were just kind of fascinated by doing labs. They haven't really had the opportunity, to do many labs. But at the end of the day, after, we probably spent about a third, I'd say, yeah, 3 or 4 weeks, like, on the science of it and the literacy of it. Just on Thursday, I had a team of 3 elementary ed majors who straight up told me I am not a science person at the beginning of the course, and they were very nervous. They taught a kindergarten lesson incorporating climate science with math. They had a pie chart where, they actually had pieces of pie cut out, and you had to pick the right colors and put it in. And they did some social sciences through weather patterns and what you should wear, and then some more science through precipitation types. And it is my belief that they will leave that class, that we have to at least offer it, if not require it, with some client science literacy and like a toolbox of pedagogy to use in the future, that they have some go-to things and they feel some confidence teaching that.
That's I mean, Yan Yan, do you have any other thoughts on teacher training and professional development? Our research found that 3/4 of teachers said they've never received any sort of training on teaching climate change.
Right. Yeah. I agree with Beth and really appreciate how she starts with that. We do need to start with some kind of background or understanding in climate science that as much as we see the effects of like, crazy weather patterns and other things that are happening, there is a science behind it that we really should understand. So, um, it's it does seem like a good place in elementary school to start that when you generally have in the United States one teacher that does multiple subjects and can kind of connect all of that, can start with the basic understandings of climate science and then bridge into social studies and then connect that to reading a pie chart or other math and English and really showing how climate science and climate change does hit all of the standards in every subject area. And then as we get into middle school and high school, I feel like as a non-science teacher, it does get a little tricky there because now, their kids are focused in one subject area at a time, and there's not necessarily a whole lot of overlap unless teachers and schools are very intentional about it. But this could be another way to carry over what Beth is talking about into middle school and high school is how can teachers work together to share this load of teaching climate change? How can the science teacher teach this part of it? How can it carry over into social studies and math and English? And, as a whole group, really discuss a whole topic or a whole nature of one aspect of climate change.
I'd just like to follow up on that as well with what Yan Yan was saying. The very first class period, I did a teaching strategy. It's called Four Corners. If you don't know what it is, it's like one corner is strongly agree, the other corner of the room is agree, the other corner is strongly disagree, and the other one is disagree. So I I just really had no idea, where the students would be. So on the first day of class, I gave them this prompt and I said, do you think taking action now against climate change will make your life better and or safer in your lifetime? And I only had one student that completely disagreed. Everybody else was on the other side of the room. So, and I think there's some questions about this later. I feel strongly that even with how big and global this issue is, students have hope but they want actionable things that they can do. They want to know, what can I do?
Yeah, that leads us really well into this next question, which is that climate change can bring up some very intense emotions. Nearly 4 in 10 high school students in our survey said that they feel anxious when they think about climate change. So I'd love to hear from both of you. How can teachers address this subject without triggering more anxiety or fear?
Okay, I'll pop in. Like I said, my undergraduate concentration was in geoscience. So uh, I have found that geologic timeline is a great way for my high school and college, pre-service teachers to understand this issue. So there's a strategy. It's called part of the picture. So I cropped a picture of 500,000 years before present of global mean temperatures. And so I cropped it just from 10,000 years ago to today. And we've all seen it. The climate, it has just been increasing, increasing, increasing. And so we said, okay, you know, in a small group, what kind of feelings do you have? And they were anxious and they were very upset about this. And what do we need to do? And obviously I didn't tell them that this strategy was called part of the picture. So we had a nice long discussion about that. And then on the next slide, I brought this up and it showed 500,000 years before present. And it's almost like a predator prey graph, like up and down, up and down, up and down every, um, you know, it's about 100,000 years or so. And they were like, wait, what? So it helped them, just to give them some, I don't know if hope is the right word, but some understanding that, yes, we have been putting carbon into the atmosphere at an astronomical rate, but during the Carboniferous period, it was all being trapped because we didn't have the decomposers to break it down. So just kind of making them feel, maybe not quite as responsible for everything that has happened, as a beginning point to kind of alleviate some of that anxiety that, humans are terrible. And then, as we've gone through the course, kind of talked more about what can we do and what have we done, what have we done in the last, few hundred years that have really caused astronomical changes that are not typical in geologic time.
As a more humanities teacher, I take the I guess more social science approach. So I build in, and with middle schoolers, they're already a whole interesting ball of all sorts of feelings. And so I build in and bring in a lot of social emotional learning activities, community building, kind of like a game I know very well too, Beth, with the Four Corners, and changing that up as well. So community building activities, I often move the desks in my classroom. We make a circle and kind of go through some very guided questions that help identify feelings, and really kind of teaching all of us how can we sit in them and not have them overwhelm us. And then different people need different things from there, different kinds of processing, whether it be journal writing or art or movement, and then often into action too. It's like, hey, I'm feeling this way about this, and this is what I understand about my feelings. Are there some things that I could do to help maybe move through this feeling of anxiety or fear, or understanding that it may not take it away, but that there are positive ways to kind of move through that. So so I kind of bring in more of those social emotional learning toolkit that's helpful dealing with climate change, anxiety, but also just anxiety and fear and feeling overwhelmed in general with anything.
So we've talked about feelings and anxiety, and now I want to talk about skepticism. We found in our polling that students in rural areas are more skeptical of the scientific consensus that climate change is happening and that it's primarily driven by human activity. And that's compared to their peers in towns, suburban areas, and urban areas. So, and Beth, we'll start with you. How should teachers approach this topic in communities, not necessarily just rural ones, where there may be a lot of skepticism from students or parents or even administrators?
Okay, unfortunately, that kind of skepticism is not new to me. I have dealt with that with just geologic timeline in general, it not being accepted by certain religious communities, and evolution and so forth. So I am a big advocate of just focusing on the science, like, and not that you can have feelings about the science, but let's talk about, my job is to teach you, the science of this. So the National Science Teachers Association, if anybody needs a rationale for what they're doing, I highly recommend you download this and Google it right now. It is a position statement on climate science. I gave it to all of my pre-service teachers, and they absolutely love it. I use that as my justification and rationale for what I am teaching. They have 15 declarations for teachers that are based on peer review research. Just, this is why we're teaching it. This is what the science says. And then they provide support structures, like, what should our administrators be doing? What should our school boards be doing in light of this information? Our policymakers, parents, community members, the whole thing. It's about 2.5, it's not super long. It probably sounds longer the way I'm describing it. But it is a great resource to have, in with your lesson plans or anywhere. And it also, at the end, it provides support for dealing with people and parents with different belief systems, and just kind of understanding that a paradigm shift is necessary, and that it's just going to take time. And this isn't going to happen overnight. And we can feel very passionate about it, which obviously I do. But, we can't strong arm people into do it. This has to be a delicate step-by-step process, and using the the research and why we're teaching it and why it evokes these strong feelings. We can just keep falling back on the science.
I agree with Beth in that we can't strong arm them. Honestly, this is a hard question for me because I feel like I'm still trying to figure out how to address this. And, I tell certain students or families, I'm like, look, it's not necessarily my job to convince you. I'm not gonna argue with you, but I'm gonna present to you good quality information. And no matter where we are on this continuum of what we think about climate change, we're going to learn something, and we're going to learn something together. And if your opinions change, that's great, and if they don't, that's okay. Um, and yeah, I guess I just feel like, okay, it's right now it's my job to bring awareness, to teach these things, to expose, and and where kids and parents take it from there. That's I guess that's their call. It is hard because I know there are some teachers. I've had parents that have asked specifically or said, I don't like this resource. Can we do something else, or can I skip this lesson? And ultimately, sometimes with certain schools or districts, that has the greater say. So I feel like sometimes as a teacher, I do what I can, and I will encourage other teachers too to do what we can, and I guess go from there.
So I love that you both acknowledge that, one, this is a issue that you're still trying to figure out, but two, it's also not a new issue, that this isn't the first controversial or potentially controversial thing that teachers have had to teach or deal with. So I want to kind of move from this sort of bigger picture to something a little bit more specific here, which is the idea of teaching about global warming and climate change through the carbon footprint exercise. A lot of teachers use the carbon footprint exercise to teach about this topic. And they have students attempt to calculate how much greenhouse gas their activities produce in their day-to-day lives. But, through the course of our reporting, Maddie and I have found that educators are somewhat divided on this exercise. Some say the idea was, created and promoted by oil companies in order to seed this idea that it's individuals who need to reduce their carbon footprints and take the focus off of the industry itself, which is by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But some educators see value in this exercise to help students just sort of wrap their heads around the problem, and kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, just sort of draw these connections that really bring the science home and help them understand it better. And I want to know, where do the two of you fall in this debate and why? And Yan, let's start with you. I'm going to put you on the spot first this time.
No problem. Happy to share. I guess for me, when I see this, I definitely see both sides. I've heard both sides, and I approach it in a with and. I'm like, we can have both, even if it was maybe, sure, if it was created for corporations to kind of take the heat off of them. But I guess when I approach this activity, or when I talk about it with kids, it's I feel like I use it as a tool to talk about, look, there's an individual responsibility. There's also an organizational and corporate responsibility, and a larger social responsibility. And ultimately, both of those need to happen, right, in order for us to really fully address climate change issues. And so I guess I try to pull out from the debate, and really look at, okay, what are the positives for both, right? So if individuals are doing this, it's a great kind of just a personal assessment of, hey, where am I? Are there some little things that I didn't see? How can I make some adjustments? And even then, taking it up a little bit. So if you have an individual unit, what about as a family? What about as a class? What about as a school? What about as a community? And even from there, challenging different organizations, whether they be local ones, national or global, to kind of also do the same. But I try to take a step back and rather than point fingers at either, it's like, hey, there needs to be a collective effort, and that's really the point. of what needs to happen, and everybody collectively and individually um, need to kind of take that assessment and make some choices that are going to be different moving forward.
Okay, I absolutely think that it is worth it. Um, and I am talking from a high school and, college, pre-service teacher perspective. Primarily because, in my experience, students want to do something. If they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what to do. So, whether it's buying from an environmentally friendly company, which I can tell you my students are so passionate about right now, they really look to see, um, if they're on Amazon, you can actually search, instead of just searching, is it Prime? They can search, does this company have an environmental friendly statement on what they're doing? What I found to be the most surprising is that students learn that how they eat impacts the climate, and the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. They have no idea the, kind of, if you're eating kiwi in the winter here in the Northeast, whoa, that traveled really far and they used fossil fuels for that. If we are, eating meat every day of the week, like they had no conceptual knowledge of the concept, between the way that they were living and the greenhouse gas emissions. So, for one thing, like I had them come up with, what would you do? And they came up with a really interesting, and this came from my students. This did not come from me, but um, only 5% of Americans are vegetarians. And so they were just talking about, if you did Meatless Monday, or if you did this, that 1 in 7 would, it would be, if everybody just did it 1 day a week, it would be 15% reduction instead of 5%, as far as the impact of meat eating. And that made them feel extremely empowered. And I had students say, they went back and told their families at Thanksgiving, and their families didn't know, the connection between that. So I do think it is worth it. I absolutely think there's a corporate piece that goes to this as well. I'm not negating that point, but my job is with students, and they need to be able to feel empowered to start making that connection from their choices to the global community. And I believe that's a springboard for them in the future, as far as if they work at a corporation or whatever kind of voting they do or things that they promote, to make them feel part of it.
I'm glad you brought up the empowerment piece, because I've heard from teachers who have said things like, a lot of times students, especially in younger grades, they don't really have a say in some of the choices their families makes. Whether it's what kind of car they drive, or just broader household decisions. And so teaching them about something that they can personally do can be quite empowering. And our survey found that half of high school students that we surveyed said they want to learn more about what they can personally do to lessen the effects of climate change. So there is interest there. And beyond what you mentioned, Beth, I mean, how should educators approach teaching that, and giving them concrete ideas, and about ways they can kind of take this into their own hands?
So what I have found is our personal reductions in our own footprint cannot keep up with the astronomical population growth that we are experiencing on Earth. So, and the students see that. Like, we in the United States, we've been doing a very good job in our per capita reduction in greenhouse emissions, but overall, on the global scale, we are increasing. And so I have just and this is, I have no scientific evidence on this. This is just what has been working for me, is we've been talking a lot about carbon sequestering. And so I brought in a couple carbon sequestering labs, and this is about how okay, it's already in the atmosphere. What could we do now to get it out? And how could we get it out faster? Because it's still increasing, even though per capita, almost everybody is doing better than we were. So we did a lab. I did the lab with the students where we measured different plants in like a controlled environment, and we measured the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air around different plants, and just kind of said, wow, what if the research moving in that direction, we could find the plants, not just planting any plant, but what if the type of plant really matters? So I really try to trigger their curiosity in out of the box like areas, instead of just oh well, we should recycle, or do this. Like, all right, we've already done it, how can we pull it out of the atmosphere?
Yan Yan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not much more. I think I deferred to Beth on that question.
Yeah, so then I want to talk a little bit about other sources of information for teens and students and K-12 students on climate change. In particular, more than half of teens, 56%, said in our survey that they learned some or a lot about climate change from social media. And I guess first question I have is, what are your reactions to that number? Does that alarm you? Does that encourage you? Yen Yen, let's get your take on that.
That's an interesting percentage. I guess it doesn't alarm me. I think it encourages me. I think I'm curious. What are they learning about climate change from social media? Would be my question. Is it like within a certain topic within climate change, or a certain aspect of that? I don't know if you had that data or if it was just a general
Yeah, I don't have that
56%.
data in particular, what they learn, just sort of where do you get your information about climate change. The data I can give you is comparison points. The largest share said they learned about climate change, or they got their information about climate change from teachers. So 66% of teens said that they got their information about climate change, some or a lot, from their teachers. And then 64% said that they learned some or a lot about the topic from their parents. So just to kind of recap, it was first teachers, second parents, and third social media.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's an interesting kind of balance of all three sources of information. I guess I'm more on the encouraged side that they're getting some information somewhere. But yeah, there is kind of that like pause on what kind of information are you getting, and how meaningful or true is it, and where do we go from there?
And Beth, what are your thoughts on that?
It doesn't surprise me one bit. Students have asked me to do TikToks with them. I absolutely refuse. But I will tell you, keeping that dialogue open and realizing that social media is really, I don't want to say is no different, but we dealt with bad paper media of the past. The difference between, like the New York Times and the National Enquirer or whatever. My job as a teacher is not to tell them what to think, but what to think about. And so I try to teach them to look at the source of the information, like who is putting this information out there, and to just be critical of the source. And my role, like I said, is just to answer those questions. And if they like nonchalantly are asking you something, I will tell you, 22 years of experience says students are looking to adults for guidance. They may not say it aloud. They may not say, I really want you to tell me if this person's right or wrong, just trying to let them know if this, like, where do we find out if that's a legitimate post? How do we do it? What are you going to do when you walk out my door next year? So I typically try to help them figure out, is this legitimate or not? And just to model good scientific, literally, we don't believe everything we say, but we can find out as much as we can about it.
Beth, what would you say is sort of the number one tip you would give science educators and how to teach students media literacy or science literacy in their classes, how to address things like climate change, misinformation or disinformation? What's the number one tip you would give other science teachers?
Wow. I definitely would say that students, they see what's happening, and it's just like, the 5-year-old that's following you around saying, "Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Why are hurricanes getting stronger? We know that they are, but why?" So, and this is what I'm seeing in the grade levels, that I teach, and they want to know that, when the ice caps melt, they love knowing why. That the salinity of the ocean goes down. Well, then it's not as dense, and then you get, rises at the shoreline, and um, because that is not what they're hearing on TikTok. That is not what they're reading in the paper. That's not what they're hearing on social media. So my job as a science educator is to help them in the best way I can, make something very complex and very difficult into smaller chunks that they can understand. So I think that would be my advice, is to not try to teach everything, but to teach the biggest things first, and then get more specific as you go on. But they really don't want to know that it's happening. They want to know why it's happening and what they can do.
And Yen, I'd like to get your thoughts on how teachers should address climate change, misinformation or disinformation, and in particular, maybe touch on the idea, is this even an educator's job? And we've talked about how much educators have on their plates already, and we're adding this on top of it. Would you make an argument that this is the role of an educator?
Uh, yes, I would, because whether it's climate change or I don't know, math facts or how to write a sentence, our job as teachers is to present and teach good information. And so if we throw in climate change in with it too, I don't see that as necessarily something that should be treated differently because it's climate change. And I know in terms of in social studies and English, there is a standard oftentimes in a lot of grade levels about research, and using that to really kind of like what Beth said too is especially where there's so much information now that's out there for all of us to get to. So how do we really look at which ones are valid, which one is just someone just kind of said a random sentence, which one has the backing of different science things or properly vetted or anything like that. So that's a life skill that relates to climate change, but also relates to researching any kind of information, is really looking at those sources, and teaching ourselves and our students, right? How do we find the right sources, not just for like what we want to hear and what we want to believe, but that has the correct information to inform us, that we can learn from and then we can make changes from.
Going back to our survey, a little more than a quarter of teens said that they think climate change is going to affect what kind of career they want to have. And another 20% said it will affect where they study or what they study and where they study in college. So I'm curious, what do you guys think that schools are doing enough to prepare students for a future workforce that will be altered, at least to some extent, by a changing climate?
I can jump in first on this one. I feel like, Beth, you'll have more to say on preparing them for the workforce. I feel like in the grades that I'm in, high school and middle school, it's slightly less about the workforce and more about just what is life going to be like for us. Like where we're going to live, where I'm going to choose to live. I can't live there because this hurricane or that tornado or a drought or a flood. Some of those more tangible experiences, right? Like, am I going to have a family, or all of those questions. And I feel like, especially with climate change, and teaching not just about climate change, but the effects and the impacts, and addressing those, that schools have been just really, really reactive. And I kind of feel like that now, even as some states are passing now climate change standards, it's like, okay, great, here are these standards. Now you have to teach them, go. And it's like, oh no, what do we do now? And how are we going to do this? And um, very, very reactive. And if there's a way for schools to kind of get out of that reactive mode, and okay, so this is where we are. This is what, things are going to look like. How can we be proactive in starting to bring this into our curriculum and teach kids so that they can make better choices, or they can be informed enough to make the choices that they're going to want to make. And so I know one thing, and I'd referenced this before, especially in middle and high school, when our subjects are so divided and seemingly so isolated from one another, if there's a way to bring in climate change and climate science, and have more interdisciplinary aspects with that, I think that will help prepare students, for being able to see the big picture of what's happening in terms of the mechanics of the science and how is it impacting these things. Okay, what are some action points that I can do, at what area, and then how can I make these decisions for myself in the future.
I agree with Yan Yan about that it really matters when the individual teachers are face to face with students, that we need to reassure them that this isn't the first time we have faced, problems as a society, as a species, and that necessity breeds invention, that they need to be curious, that I love that they're thinking about these problems, and what could an engineer do, or what could a mathematician do, or how could we analyze this data, and I just keep encouraging that, if you have basic scientific literacy, which of course climate science is part of that literacy, and problem solving skills, that they will be able to apply that to any field. Most recently, though, I will say that I've really brought in the social justice piece with, climate science in particular, and urban heat islands and areas where, people don't have the means or the option to just get up and leave their environment. We kind of talked about, like, kind of a closed system, like a pond or something. Like you have to help and be aware that it's all of our responsibility to make sure that people, have access to, air conditioning with increasing temperatures, and students really care about that, social justice piece, and want to be involved. And we talk a lot about what we can do to help one another, and that's what I think we can do the most. I don't think we'll be able to change a whole, science department, a whole school district very quickly, but it really does start with relationships between individual students and their teachers.
So this is our last question for the two of you. And this question is a bit long, but bear with me. We found in our nationally representative survey that while a strong majority of teens agreed with the scientific consensus that the climate is changing and that global warming is mainly driven by human activity, their understanding of the mechanics behind climate change was shakier. For example, only 44% correctly identified that the greenhouse effect is when gases in our atmosphere trap heat and block it from escaping our planet. Meanwhile, I think 46% said that a hole in the ozone layer created by gases from spray cans and refrigerators is a significant contributor to global warming. And a little more than a quarter agreed that solar flares and increased radiation from the sun are major drivers of global warming since the 1800s. So you can see that it's really kind of scattered here, the understanding. And I want to know from you guys, what's happening here? Why are so many students right on the big picture, but fuzzy on the details and doesn't matter? Yen Yen, could you start us off?
I was going to have Beth go first, since I feel like she spoke about this a little bit, and might be a little bit more of an expert. Beth, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure, sure. I mean, in my own experience, I definitely think this matters. I personally believe it has happened because when I started my career 22 years ago, I had time in my earth and space science curriculum, which was in the high school, by the way, I could teach, a unit on oceanography and meteorology, and students had a basic understanding. Then climate science was just connecting the dots. The problem is earth sciences at the high school level has not been prioritized in the United States education system. For example, in Pennsylvania, we have earth science standards, but only biology content is assessed. So teachers and our whole school are ranked on biology. Also, furthermore, there is no AP exam for earth sciences at all. So, with this lack of basic atmospheric and global sciences, students cannot understand the details. They do not have the background knowledge for it. For example, my students that came into my climate science class, they're all college level. They could not differentiate between the greenhouse effect and global warming. They thought the greenhouse effect was bad. And so just that basic earth science system it's just not there. They're just not getting it.
I agree with Beth that the details matter. And even though, I'm not a scientist and I can't explain, every single step of the greenhouse effect, um, or the, carbon process, the details do matter. And I think in general, maybe why this is happening is we see results or consequences once they affect us. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to all the little details that go into it until suddenly, there's this big devastating event that affects us, and then we kind of go back, and so many people then just kind of try to fill in the details with what seems the most logical to them to explain this big result or the consequence. But if we really are going to bring change, we do have to understand the details. We have to understand why, the why behind these things happening in terms of a science perspective. And then, and if we can understand it from there, then there's a better path moving forward. Beth mentioned social justice, and yeah, I'm seeing a lot of social justice and climate change coming together, and really the exploration of why are certain communities affected so much more than others in terms of climate change, and understanding the details of some of the science behind there. Yeah, why are urban places hotter? Why do trees help? Like understanding the science behind those and the details behind those can help students who want to go into urban planning, or can help students who want to address that issue do it a lot better when they're informed about the details.
Thank you both so much for that. It's such an interesting topic, and I see what you mean that there's sort of that, yes, you need to know the details, but at the same time, how much detail do you need in order to be an engaged and a citizen and a knowledgeable citizen? So thank you both for answering that.
Yeah, thank you all so much again for joining, and a special thanks to our guests Elizabeth and Yan Yan for sharing their expertise on this topic, and just for their willingness to sit down with us this evening. On that note, I will go ahead and end this space, but I hope all of you have a great evening, and please make sure to check out all of EdWeek's climate coverage in the future.